I burned your things so you'd finally learn respect. Richard Carter said calmly as thin gray smoke drifted above the backyard grill, and the last of Daniel Carter's belongings disappeared into the flames of a metal barrel behind the house. A quiet suburban home on Maple Ridge Drive, where neighbors pretended not to notice the strange lessons Richard liked to teach. Daniel stood near the fence that evening at 19 years old, hands in the pockets of a worn denim jacket, watching pieces of his life vanish one by one while his father spoke about discipline as if he were delivering a lecture rather than humiliating his own son in front of half the block. Richard had always believed that authority should never be questioned, and for 30 years that belief ruled the Carter household with the certainty of gravity, because in Richard's mind the house itself was proof of his power. A two-story colonial he had purchased in 1987 that he liked to describe as the reward for doing things the right way, a phrase Daniel had heard so often it had lost all meaning. The rule was simple and repeated like scripture at dinner tables and family holidays. This house belongs to me. These walls belong to me. And anyone living here follows my rules. Daniel's mother Melissa used to soften those words with quiet smiles and careful glances that told her son not to argue. But after she passed away, the house became colder, the rooms echoing with Richard's voice and the constant reminder that gratitude meant obedience. That night in the backyard was not really about the old laptop, the sketchbooks, or the small box of college brochures Daniel had hidden in his closet. It was about the decision Daniel had made earlier that week when he told his father he wanted to leave home and study graphic design in Chicago, a city nearly 800 miles away, and a future Richard called foolish, irresponsible, and embarrassing. Richard did not yell when Daniel said it, which somehow made the moment worse, because the quiet response carried the weight of judgment rather than anger. And within hours Richard had gathered Daniel's things and carried them outside as if they were clutter that needed clearing. Neighbors later said they thought it was just a routine cleanup, maybe old junk from the garage, but Daniel knew exactly what it meant because his father looked at him before striking the match and said the same words he had repeated for years whenever Daniel questioned anything. Sometimes boys need a lesson. Daniel did not shout, did not argue, and did not beg for his things back, because by that point he had learned that arguments only fueled Richard's certainty. So instead he watched the smoke curl into the evening sky while the backyard lights flickered on across the street, and the quiet rhythm of suburban life continued as if nothing unusual was happening. A few minutes later Daniel picked up the only bag his father had not noticed, a faded backpack with $47 inside, and walked down Maple Ridge Drive past the mailbox with the Carter name printed in black letters, past the oak tree his mother used to decorate with Christmas lights, and past the house Richard believed would always belong to him. 3 years later, the property would appear on a real estate website with a simple headline, announcing that the Carter residence was finally for sale, and the first serious buyer to schedule a viewing would arrive in a dark sedan, step onto the same front walkway he once left as a teenager, and quietly sign the paperwork that transferred ownership of the house. Daniel Carter slept on a narrow couch in Kevin Ross's small apartment the first night after leaving Maple Ridge Drive, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above him while the quiet hum of city traffic slipped through the cracked window. And for the first time in years the silence did not feel like tension waiting to explode, but like something unfamiliar and fragile called freedom. Kevin had known Daniel since middle school, and he did not ask many questions that night. He only handed Daniel a spare blanket and said that the couch was not comfortable, but it would work for a while, and Daniel nodded because he did not yet know how long a while might be. The next morning Daniel woke up before sunrise, the same habit he had developed living under Richard Carter's roof, where sleeping late was considered laziness, and he sat at the tiny kitchen table looking at the $47 in his wallet and the empty space where the future used to exist. He did not have a computer anymore, and he did not have the sketchbooks he had filled during years of quiet practice. But the strange thing was that the ideas in his mind had not disappeared with the smoke in the backyard. They were still there waiting for a place to live. Within 2 days Daniel found a job at a coffee shop 3 blocks away, where the manager needed someone willing to work early mornings. And Daniel said yes before the manager even finished describing the schedule, because at that moment any steady paycheck felt like a bridge between the life he had left and the life he hoped might exist someday. The routine began quickly, and it was simple. Wake up at 4:30 in the morning, walk through the cold air to open the cafe at 5, serve commuters who barely looked up from their phones, then spend the afternoons at the public library, where rows of quiet computers became Daniel's temporary workshop. At first, the designs he created were rough because he had to relearn tools he once practiced comfortably on his old laptop, but week after week the work improved, and the librarian who supervised the computer section began recognizing him as the young man who arrived every afternoon with the same quiet determination. Kevin would sometimes stop by the library after his own job and sit across the table watching Daniel sketch ideas on scrap paper before turning them into digital images. And once he asked whether Daniel ever thought about going back home, but Daniel only shook his head slowly and said that some houses stop feeling like home long before a person walks out the door. Meanwhile, Maple Ridge Drive continued exactly as it always had, with trimmed lawns, weekend barbecues, and Richard Carter greeting neighbors with the confidence of a man who believed discipline was the same thing as respect. And if anyone asked about his son, he would simply say that Daniel had decided to go learn how the real world works, which sounded almost generous if someone did not know the whole story. Months passed, and Daniel saved every dollar he could after paying Kevin a small share of the rent. And one evening as summer turned into autumn, he used a portion of those savings to enroll in a night course at a community college where graphic design students spent hours studying typography, color theory, and digital layout, and sitting in that classroom. Daniel realized that the future he once described nervously to his father had not vanished after all. It had only been delayed. The strange thing about quiet progress is that it rarely looks impressive day by day. But by the end of the first year, Daniel was no longer the teenager who had walked down Maple Ridge Drive carrying a single backpack. He had become a young man building something steady and patient piece by piece. And although he never spoke Richard Carter's name, during those years there were nights when Daniel remembered the words his father repeated so often about houses and rules and ownership. And he would close his laptop slowly and wonder what his father would say if he knew that the boy he tried to correct had begun learning lessons of his own. By the second year, Daniel Carter no longer thought of himself as someone starting over, because the quiet rhythm of effort had slowly reshaped his life into something stable and purposeful. His mornings still began before sunrise at the cafe, but the afternoons at the library had evolved into evenings spent in the design studio at the community college, where rows of computers glowed beneath fluorescent lights and students debated fonts, color palettes, and the invisible psychology behind a well-balanced layout. And although Daniel rarely spoke about his past, the instructors noticed his unusual patience because he approached each assignment as if he were rebuilding something important piece by piece rather than simply completing a class project. The small freelance jobs began almost by accident when a local bakery owner asked whether someone in the class could redesign a simple menu board. And Daniel volunteered quietly after the lecture ended, spending 3 nights refining the layout until the design looked clean and welcoming. And when the bakery owner paid him $200 for the work, Daniel stared at the envelope for a long moment, because it felt less like payment and more like proof that the future he imagined might actually exist. From that moment, the opportunities appeared slowly but steadily. A barber shop that needed a new sign, a landscaping company that wanted a logo, a church newsletter that required a simple layout, and Daniel accepted every small project, no matter how modest, because each one added another step forward. Kevin Ross continued to watch the progress with quiet pride from the same kitchen table where Daniel had once counted $47 and wondered how life would begin again. And one evening, Kevin joked that Daniel was becoming the busiest designer in the neighborhood, but Daniel only smiled and said that he was still learning how to build something that could last. During those years, Maple Ridge Drive existed only as a distant memory Daniel rarely visited in conversation or thought. Yet sometimes while walking home late at night, he would remember his father standing beside the metal barrel in the backyard speaking about lessons and respect, as if they were objects that could be forced into existence. And the memory no longer filled Daniel with anger, but with a calm realization that some lessons take longer to understand than others. 3 years after the night he left home, Daniel rented a small office above a hardware store downtown, where the narrow window overlooked a busy intersection and the sign on the door read Carter Design Studio in simple black lettering. And the first time he unlocked that office, he paused for a moment before stepping inside, because the quiet room represented something larger than success or independence. It represented the slow proof that patience can transform humiliation into strength. The business remained modest, but steady, with projects arriving from word of mouth and small local advertisements. And Daniel worked late most nights refining layouts while the sounds of traffic drifted upward from the street below, unaware that far across town the house on Maple Ridge Drive had begun facing problems that even Richard Carter could not control. Because property taxes had quietly increased year after year, while retirement savings shrank faster than expected, and although Richard continued presenting the image of confidence to his neighbors, the numbers inside his mailbox told a different story. A story that would soon place the house he believed defined his authority onto the open market, where anyone with the right offer could claim it. The first sign that something had changed on Maple Ridge Drive appeared on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when Daniel Carter opened his laptop inside Carter Design Studio to review a new client request and noticed a familiar street name listed in the local real estate updates he sometimes scanned out of habit, and although he rarely paid attention to residential listings, the address caught his eye immediately, because Maple Ridge Drive was not a place he expected to see among the rotating advertisements for open houses and suburban renovations. Daniel hesitated for a moment before clicking the listing, not out of nostalgia, but out of curiosity, and the photograph that appeared on the screen showed the same two-story colonial house with white siding, the same front porch railing, and the same oak tree standing beside the driveway where his mother Melissa once hung strings of small holiday lights every December. The description beneath the photograph was simple and professional: 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a quiet neighborhood, recently listed due to owner downsizing. And Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, realizing that the house Richard Carter had always spoken about as permanent had quietly become just another property available for purchase. The strange part was that Daniel did not feel anger or triumph when he saw the listing, only a calm awareness that time had moved forward for both of them, whether they acknowledged it or not. Across town, Richard Carter sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by envelopes and paperwork that had grown heavier with each passing year. Property taxes had increased steadily, while retirement income remained fixed, and the house that once symbolized stability had gradually become expensive to maintain. Yet Richard still told neighbors that selling was simply a practical decision because the place was larger than he needed. Now, the real estate agent handling the property was Laura Jenkins, a patient professional who had sold homes throughout the area for more than a decade, and she spent an afternoon walking through the house, taking photographs of each room, while Richard followed behind her, explaining small details about the construction and the improvements he believed made the property valuable, mentioning the hardwood floors he installed himself and the backyard where he once hosted summer cookouts. When Laura asked whether there had been any recent offers, Richard shook his head and said the listing had only gone live that morning, but he expected interest soon because houses in the neighborhood usually attracted buyers quickly. Meanwhile, Daniel continued reading the listing description in his quiet office above the hardware store, while traffic moved steadily through the intersection below his window. And something about the moment felt strangely balanced, as if the long distance between past and present had suddenly shortened into a single, quiet decision waiting to be made. He closed the advertisement for a moment and looked around Carter Design Studio at the modest desks, the design sketches pinned neatly to the wall, and the framed certificate from the community college program that had once seemed impossible to finish. And then he opened the listing again and studied the photographs more carefully. The front door looked exactly the same as the night he walked away carrying a single backpack, and for a brief second Daniel imagined the echo of footsteps along Maple Ridge Drive fading into the distance years earlier. But the memory no longer carried bitterness because life had grown larger than that moment. Instead, Daniel picked up his phone, searched for the contact information listed beneath the advertisement, and called the real estate agent to ask a simple question about scheduling a viewing. And when Laura Jenkins answered with a polite greeting, Daniel introduced himself calmly, without explaining anything about his connection to the property, because sometimes the most important decisions in life begin with nothing more dramatic than a quiet phone call. 2 days after the phone call, Daniel Carter parked his car on Maple Ridge Drive and sat quietly behind the steering wheel for a moment before stepping out, studying the familiar street with the distant calm of someone revisiting a place that had once shaped his life but no longer defined it. The neighborhood looked almost exactly the same as it had years earlier: the trimmed lawns, the identical mailboxes, the quiet hum of suburban routine. Yet time had added small changes that only someone who remembered the past would notice. The oak tree beside the driveway had grown taller, the porch railing had been repainted, and the once bright white siding carried faint signs of weather and age. Laura Jenkins arrived a few minutes later carrying a folder of paperwork and greeted Daniel with the professional warmth of someone accustomed to showing properties to curious buyers, unaware that the quiet man standing beside the sidewalk had once lived behind the same front door. When she unlocked the entrance and pushed the door open, Daniel stepped inside slowly, not as someone reclaiming a memory, but as someone evaluating a property with careful attention, noticing the creak of the hardwood floors, the angle of sunlight entering through the living room windows, and the faint scent of old furniture that lingered in the hallway. Laura began describing the features of the house in her practiced voice, mentioning the square footage, the structure of the basement, and the layout of the upstairs bedrooms, and Daniel listened politely while walking through each room with measured steps, occasionally nodding as if considering the practicality of the space rather than the quiet echoes of childhood routines that once filled the same walls. The kitchen looked smaller than he remembered, though the counter where his mother Melissa used to prepare breakfast remained in the same place beneath the window overlooking the backyard, and Daniel paused briefly there before continuing through the house, while Laura explained the recent listing price and the amount the current owner hoped to receive in a quick sale. Outside, the backyard appeared calmer than Daniel expected. The same stretch of grass bordered by a wooden fence, and the same corner where the metal barrel had once stood during a lesson his father believed would shape the future. Yet now the yard looked like any other suburban lawn waiting for the next family to claim it. When the tour finished, Laura asked the usual question she posed to every potential buyer: whether Daniel wanted time to think about the offer or if he planned to explore other listings in the area. And Daniel answered with the same calm tone he used when speaking with business clients at Carter Design Studio, explaining that the house seemed well maintained and that he would consider making a formal offer soon. Laura nodded and handed him a printed sheet detailing the price and conditions of the sale, while Daniel thanked her for the tour and walked back toward his car, the late afternoon sunlight stretching long shadows across Maple Ridge Drive as children rode bicycles near the corner and a neighbor watered the front lawn. Sitting in the driver's seat again, Daniel placed the property information on the passenger seat and looked once more at the house through the windshield, not with resentment, but with the quiet understanding that time had transformed both the building and the boy who once left it behind. And after a moment, he started the engine and drove back toward downtown, knowing that the next step would not require anger or confrontation, but only a simple decision written carefully on a purchase offer. The following morning, Daniel Carter arrived at Carter Design Studio earlier than usual and placed the property information from Maple Ridge Drive on his desk beside a stack of design drafts. And for several minutes, he simply studied the printed sheet, while sunlight slowly filled the narrow office window overlooking the intersection below. Because the decision he was considering was not impulsive and he understood that buying a house was not the same as accepting a freelance project or signing a client contract. Yet something about the quiet logic of the situation felt clear in his mind. The listing price Laura Jenkins had provided was reasonable for the neighborhood, and Daniel knew that the steady growth of his design studio during the past few years had placed him in a position he once believed impossible. His savings account reflected countless nights of patient work and small victories that gradually accumulated into financial stability. And although he had never imagined spending that stability on the very place he once left behind, the numbers on the page suggested that the purchase was entirely realistic. Later that morning, Daniel called the bank that handled his business accounts and scheduled a brief meeting with a financial advisor who reviewed the available funds and confirmed that a full offer without complicated financing would place Daniel in a strong position compared to other potential buyers. And when the advisor finished explaining the details, Daniel thanked him calmly and said he would move forward with the paperwork later that afternoon. Across town, Richard Carter continued his routine with the same outward confidence he had shown for decades, greeting neighbors while collecting the mail and occasionally mentioning that the house would probably sell quickly because homes in the area rarely remained on the market for long. Yet inside the kitchen, the stack of envelopes on the table reminded him why the decision to sell had become unavoidable. The increasing property taxes and maintenance costs had quietly turned the house into a burden rather than a symbol of control. That afternoon, Laura Jenkins received an email from Daniel Carter containing a formal purchase offer written clearly and without negotiation. The price matched the full amount listed for the property and included confirmation that the buyer intended to pay in cash after a standard inspection. And Laura paused for a moment when she saw the details, because such straightforward offers often moved quickly through the closing process. She called Richard later that evening to explain that a serious buyer had already appeared and that the proposal looked solid, and Richard listened with cautious interest before agreeing to review the documents the next morning, because to him the offer represented nothing more than a practical step toward resolving his financial situation. Meanwhile, Daniel finished his workday in the quiet office above the hardware store and locked the door behind him as the sun lowered across the city skyline. And while walking toward his car, he reflected briefly on the long path that had carried him from a borrowed couch and a part-time cafe job to a moment where purchasing a home no longer sounded impossible. Yet the thought of Maple Ridge Drive did not bring excitement or revenge to his mind. It only felt like a final chapter waiting to close with the same calm patience that had shaped every step of his journey. And as Daniel drove home that evening, he knew the next phase would unfold not through confrontation, but through the quiet process of paperwork, signatures, and time. 3 days after the offer was submitted, Laura Jenkins called Richard Carter again and explained that the buyer was ready to move forward immediately if the basic inspection confirmed the house was in standard condition. And Richard listened from the same kitchen where envelopes had once piled across the table while he considered the situation with the practical mindset he had used throughout his life, because the proposal solved the financial pressure that had been quietly building for years. The inspection itself took place the following afternoon when a licensed inspector walked through the house, checking electrical outlets, measuring moisture levels in the basement, and examining the condition of the roof, while Laura observed carefully and took notes for the closing documents. And when the report arrived later that evening, it confirmed what everyone already suspected. The house was older but structurally sound, which meant the transaction could proceed without delays. Daniel Carter read the report in his office after finishing a design revision for a restaurant client and nodded calmly as he reviewed the summary, because the process had unfolded exactly as expected. The property was solid, the price remained unchanged, and the next step involved scheduling the official closing date at the local title office downtown. Meanwhile, Richard continued preparing for the transition in his own practical way by sorting through boxes of old tools in the garage and deciding which items he would take to the smaller apartment he planned to rent nearby. And although he occasionally wondered about the identity of the buyer, Laura had only described the person as a quiet professional who wanted a straightforward purchase without negotiations, which seemed unusual but not suspicious in a competitive market. A week later, Laura scheduled the closing appointment for a Friday morning at 10 o'clock and sent the final documents to both parties so they could review the terms before signing. And Daniel printed the paperwork in Carter Design Studio late Thursday night, while the office remained silent except for the faint sound of traffic moving through the intersection below his window. The document listed the purchase price clearly along with the legal description of the property on Maple Ridge Drive, and Daniel studied the page for a moment before placing it neatly inside a folder, because the significance of the moment did not come from the financial transaction itself, but from the quiet symmetry of time. Early Friday morning, Richard Carter arrived at the title office wearing the same confident posture he had carried for decades, greeting the receptionist and remarking casually that he was ready to complete the sale so he could simplify his living situation. And he waited in the conference room while Laura organized the paperwork across the polished table. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and Daniel Carter stepped inside with the calm composure of someone attending a routine business meeting. And for a brief second, Richard did not recognize him, because the years had replaced the uncertain teenager he remembered with a steady man in his early 30s. But as Daniel took the chair across the table and placed his folder beside the documents, recognition slowly appeared in Richard's expression, and the quiet room held a moment of silence while Laura glanced between them, unaware of the deeper history unfolding in front of her. Daniel did not speak immediately, because the purpose of the meeting was already written on the pages waiting to be signed, and the only sound in the room was the faint turning of paper as Laura prepared the final forms that would transfer ownership of the house on Maple Ridge Drive. The quiet conference room in the title office held a stillness that felt heavier than any argument could have been, because recognition had already changed the atmosphere between Richard Carter and the man seated across the table from him. And although Richard had spent years believing he understood the direction of every important moment in his life, he now found himself studying the face of his own son as if seeing it for the first time. Daniel Carter sat calmly with his hands resting on the folder containing the purchase documents while Laura Jenkins continued arranging the paperwork without noticing the deeper meaning of the silence between them. And after a few seconds, she began explaining the final steps of the transaction in the same steady voice she used for every closing appointment, describing the transfer of ownership, the payment confirmation, and the signatures required to complete the sale. Richard listened only partially because his attention remained fixed on Daniel, trying to understand how the uncertain teenager, who once walked away from Maple Ridge Drive, had returned as the buyer of the property itself. And the realization slowly formed not as anger, but as confusion because the situation had unfolded in a way he had never predicted. Daniel did not rush to speak because the documents on the table already explained the practical reality of the moment. The house was being sold, and the buyer had the legal right to complete the purchase. And instead, he waited while Laura pointed to the places where Richard needed to sign his name, confirming the agreement. The pen moved across the paper with deliberate strokes, and the sound of each signature echoed softly in the quiet room, marking the final step in a process that had begun with a simple online listing and a phone call days earlier. Once the last document was completed, Laura gathered the pages neatly and placed them into a folder while explaining that the funds would transfer immediately and the new owner would receive the official keys after the paperwork was processed by the title office. And only then did she look between the two men again, noticing the unusual silence that remained in the room. Richard finally leaned back slightly in his chair and spoke with a voice that sounded less certain than the one Daniel remembered from years ago, asking a simple question about how long Daniel had been planning this purchase, and Daniel answered without hesitation that the decision had been made only after he saw the house listed for sale, because life had moved forward in ways neither of them had expected. The explanation was not dramatic, and it carried no accusation, which made the moment feel even quieter than before. And Richard nodded slowly, as if absorbing the information piece by piece, while realizing that the house he once used as proof of authority had become something else entirely. Laura finished organizing the documents and handed Daniel a small envelope containing the keys along with the official confirmation of ownership, and Daniel accepted it with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the meeting before standing from the chair. For a moment, the two men faced each other across the conference table, not as parent and child, but as individuals whose lives had taken very different paths since the day Daniel walked away from Maple Ridge Drive. And although neither of them raised their voices, the room carried the quiet understanding that the balance of control had shifted in a way neither paperwork nor words could fully describe. Daniel Carter stepped out of the title office into the late morning sunlight with the small envelope of keys resting quietly in his hand, and for a moment he stood on the sidewalk looking at the familiar street across the parking lot, as if time had folded in on itself, because the path that once began with a single backpack and $47 had somehow returned him to the place where everything changed. Inside the conference room, Richard Carter remained seated for a few seconds after Daniel left, staring at the signed documents as if the simple lines of ink carried more meaning than the transaction itself, because the house on Maple Ridge Drive had always represented certainty to him, a place where his rules defined the boundaries of every conversation and every decision. Yet the quiet signature he had just written had turned that certainty into something else entirely. Daniel walked toward his car with the calm pace he had learned during years of steady work, not rushing and not looking back immediately, because the moment did not require a dramatic gesture or an argument. It only required the understanding that life had moved forward in ways neither of them had expected. When Richard finally stepped outside a few minutes later, he saw Daniel standing beside the car holding the envelope, and the two men paused across the pavement with the quiet distance of people who once shared a home but had lived separate lives for many years. Richard spoke first, asking in a restrained voice why Daniel had chosen to buy the house rather than letting someone else take it. And the question carried less accusation than confusion, because the situation did not match the simple lessons he believed he had taught long ago. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering calmly that the house was never the real lesson. The lesson had been time itself, the slow years of learning how to build something without depending on the approval of anyone else. He explained that when he saw the listing, he did not feel anger, and he did not feel the need for revenge. He simply recognized that the opportunity existed to close a chapter that had once defined his life. Richard listened without interrupting while the quiet sounds of traffic moved through the street nearby. And for the first time, he seemed to understand that authority built on control does not last as long as patience built on effort. Daniel then opened the small envelope and held the keys briefly before placing them back inside. And he said that the house would remain exactly what it had always been, a structure made of wood, brick, and memories. But the meaning attached to it had changed because the person who once believed he needed permission to leave had discovered that he never needed permission to move forward. Richard looked at his son with a thoughtful expression that replaced the certainty he once carried so easily. And although neither of them raised their voices, the moment held a quiet clarity that words alone could not fully explain. Daniel finally turned toward his car and prepared to leave. And as he did, he repeated the same phrase that had echoed through his childhood for years, but now carried a completely different meaning, explaining calmly that every house eventually belongs to the person who learns how to stand on his own. And with that simple statement, he stepped into the driver's seat and drove away, knowing that the lesson once intended to limit him had instead become the beginning of everything he had built.